Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a silk-draped room. The air heavy with the scent of sandalwood, jasmine, and something a little more illicit. You're not supposed to be here, but you are. Your bare feet pad softly across polished wooden floors, your fingertips brushing a wall scroll that trembles slightly in the breeze. Outside, a red paper lantern swings from the curved roof like a pendulum marking heartbeats. From inside the chamber ahead, there's the sound of whispered laughter, the rustle of robes, and the scratch of a needle pulling thread. Not just any thread dyed crimson with crushed cinnabar and allegedly a drop of the embroiderer's own blood. You're about to learn how love in imperial China wasn't just written in letters. It was sewn into silk, hidden in flower petals, animal motifs, and the occasional erotic koi fish that only made sense if you were, well, in the know. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not walking into a history textbook. You're entering a whisper network that operated beneath layers of satin and propriety. This is love, lust, betrayal, and rebellion, not in ink, but in silk thread. Each stitch a syllable only some were trained to read. You step into the Tang dynasty, roughly the 8th century, when Chang'an was the beating heart of an empire, with camel caravans rolling in from Samarkand and music spilling out of taverns where the pipa sang and wine cups clinked. If you're picturing tranquil tea gardens, think again. In the red light quarters known as Qinglu, where high-ranking courtesans wore gowns with sleeves so long they could hide poems or weapons, you would have found embroidery unlike anything grandma ever framed. A sleeve embroidered with plum blossoms wasn't about the season. It meant a rendezvous that night. A peacock on the hem? That was a woman saying, "I choose who looks at me." It wasn't just fashion. It was a language, as sharp and subversive as a Twitter DM from someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Now imagine a nobleman, probably drunk on rice wine and power, unwraps a robe gifted by a courtesan he's obsessed with. On the back, he sees a butterfly. Harmless? Not quite. In certain circles, that butterfly means, "I flutter briefly, I don't stay." It's a warning stitched in grace. He doesn't get it, of course. Most men didn't. That was the point. The embroidery wasn't for them. It was for other women, for the reader listeners, for the underground sisterhood that passed on meanings through generations like heirloom scandal. Some even say these meanings go back to shamanic traditions, where stitching was a sacred feminine art believed to channel dreams. And love, my friend, is just another kind of dream you wake up from. Your first real glimpse into this hidden language of love comes through a scandal, naturally. Picture this. A high-ranking official's wife in the early Tang era has had it. Her husband spends more time at the tea house than with her, and not for the oolong. One day, he gives her a silk robe to make up for it. She smiles, accepts it, then spends nights sewing her response into his travel cloak. A crane in flight, a falling plum blossom, a river winding away from a weeping willow. All symbols of abandonment and emotional death. When he wears it to court, another official's concubine, a retired embroidery teacher, bursts into laughter. Word spreads like fire across an incense-soaked room. He's humiliated, and suddenly, his wife is treated with a curious respect. Historians still argue whether she intended that public shaming, or if it was an inside joke gone too far. Either way, she stitched herself a victory. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some women believe that using a single strand of hair instead of silk thread gave their embroidery extra emotional weight, like a signature. There's an erotic poem from the Song dynasty that describes a woman using her lover's hair to stitch a lotus on her robe, so his spirit would follow the shape of her hips. Romantic? Sure, slightly stalker? Absolutely. But remember, in an age when you couldn't text, swipe, or post vague breakup memes, you made do with what you had, and what you had was thread, fabric, and an imagination sharpened by centuries of constraint. Now, let's talk about brothels, not the seedy stereotype, but the upscale, high-culture salons of Chang'an, where courtesans were trained in poetry, calligraphy, and of course, embroidery. Think less cheap thrill and more intellectual salon with benefits. These women weren't just lovers. They were cultural powerhouses. Some wore robes that took months to complete, each flower placed with symbolic precision. The more discreet the message, the higher the price. One robe survives in fragments, bearing a pattern of orchids and thorned vines that, according to an erotic scholar from the 16th century, represented pleasure entangled with pain, BDSM. Maybe not quite, but let's say the vibes were there. Slip deeper into the world of silk and longing, and you begin to notice a pattern literally. Lotus flowers, mandarin ducks, paired butterflies. Each had a layered meaning, but meaning could shift depending on context. A single lotus on a sleeve might symbolize virginity. 3 lotuses woven between waves, sexual freedom. That ambiguity was the embroidery's power. It spoke only to those fluent in the dialect of desire. And here's something wild. Even emperors weren't immune. A tale half gossip, half archival tells of an emperor who fell in love with a dancer after spotting a single embroidered peach blossom on her ankle wrap. Supposedly he asked, "Why just one blossom?" She replied, "Because I'm still waiting for the wind." Reader, he married her. Or at least kept her close enough that her foot wrap started trending in court fashion. Meanwhile, actual wives gritted their teeth and stitched their grief into pillowcases, sad swans with necks twisted away from each other. As you exhale, you realize the deeper truth. This was a world where women were not supposed to write, yet they wrote. Not on scrolls or bamboo slips, but on silk, in code, through beauty, with needles for pens. You're not just learning about embroidery, you're hearing secrets. You're reading affairs, heartbreaks, quiet rebellions, and whispered crushes. Long turned to dust. You're sleeping in the memories of those who once used thread to say what their mouths could not. The peacock watches you. Not with real eyes, of course, but with silk ones stitched so precisely into the back of a jade-colored robe that under candlelight they seem to shimmer with knowing. You blink, and for a moment, you wonder if it's winking. Welcome to the subtle seduction of embroidered symbolism, where a single motif might carry more heat than a stack of love letters. In the story that keeps being whispered across centuries, a famed concubine of the Tang dynasty named Wei Lian was said to own a robe so exquisitely embroidered that it caused men to fall in love before she even spoke. On it, wrapped around the hem and trailing up the sleeves, was a pattern of peacocks, each positioned with uncanny anatomical precision. But they weren't just birds. If you looked closer, their tail feathers merged into lotus roots, and the eyes in their plumes were, in some interpretations, not eyes at all, but stylized representations of something much more intimate. You probably won't survive this, but one chronicler claimed that Wei Lian wore the robe to tease one of the emperor's favorite poets, who found the pattern so erotically charged that he reportedly fainted into his wine bowl. And then proposed. Marriage, embroidery, one man, 0. Now, here's the thing. The peacock in Chinese symbolism is already a loaded image. It signifies beauty, pride, and attraction, but in the right context, it also becomes a metaphor for sexual power, particularly female sexual agency. Stitch that onto a garment, and you're not just decorating cloth, you're flirting in a language only the right people understand. One anecdote from a Song Dynasty manual on etiquette warns men to avoid women whose garments bear flamboyant birds, implying they might be well practiced in the games of courtship. That's a poetic way of saying, they'll eat you alive and you'll thank them. Historians still argue whether the manual was serious or satire. Either way, the women embroidered their peacocks anyway. A needle doesn't ask permission. Fast forward to the Qing dynasty, where the embroidered peacock resurfaces, this time on the back of a silk underrobe worn by a young concubine named Mei Xiong. Her patron, a merchant known more for his ego than his taste, failed to notice the sly alteration she had made to the tail feathers. Tucked discreetly among the usual flourishes were 5 tiny figures, each one bent into the position of a different Kama Sutra pose. Blink and you'd miss it, but her lover didn't. He noticed. And he laughed. And that laugh became the stuff of whispered gossip through the merchant classes, who began to request their own peacock variations. And that's how you get the short-lived underground trend of erotic embroidery, smuggled into otherwise respectable garments, hidden love letters disguised as plumage. You'll never look at a feather pattern the same way again. Let's slip into a fringe detail, shall we? In certain embroidery circles, it was believed that stitching eyes, animal or human, was dangerous. Superstition warned that eyes in thread could trap the soul of the wearer, or worse, the maker. So many artisans deliberately left eyes blank or subtly unfinished, but Wei Lian's robe, fully eyed. That was a flex. It meant she wasn't afraid of binding a man's soul to her, or perhaps she was actively trying to. There's even a claim, in a poem preserved in the Yongle-Dadian, that her robe was buried with her eyes, and also that any man who mourned her would dream of her face instead of their wife's. If that's not emotional warfare, I don't know what is. Now. Not. Every stitch told a love story. Some were acts of strategy, even survival. A mid-ranking court lady named Zhu Hua was known for her meticulous needlework. Her pillows and sashes were so ornate they were mistaken for wedding gifts, even when no marriage was pending. But one evening, while preparing a shawl for the Empress herself, she made an uncharacteristic choice. She embroidered a single peacock on a branch, looking backwards. That's symbolically rich because a backward-facing bird implied regret or watching one's past. When the Empress saw it, she reportedly froze. Her own marriage had been a political compromise, one she rarely spoke of. And yet, here it was stitched into her wardrobe, silently acknowledging her private sorrow. She didn't punish Zhu Hua. She promoted her. A woman who could sew secrets was a woman you wanted close. Or feared. Or both. And speaking of fear, here's a sex story for the books. Literally, in Sex with Kings, there's a delicious account of a 17th century Chinese prince who kept a personal harem of 11 lovers, each with their own embroidered color-coded robes. These robes weren't just decorative. They were a tracking system. One lover's robe had goldfish leaping from waves code for fertility. Another's had 2 peacocks entangled, a signal that she was open to shared pleasure. According to the author, the prince used the system to decide nightly who to visit based on the mood conveyed by their robes. Fashion is foreplay. It sounds like a sitcom, but it's astonishingly practical, if also deeply objectifying. Still, many of the women, it said, embroidered their own codes, back hidden symbols in the thread density or direction, little nudges toward autonomy within a deeply asymmetrical arrangement. Which brings us to the open scholarly question: were these embroidered codes really understood by men, or were they just decorative to them? Some researchers argue that the symbolic meanings were exaggerated in later literature, while others insist they were essential, functioning like a visual diary for women with no voice. And here's where you come in, reading it all backwards, centuries later, trying to tell whether that chrysanthemum is just a flower or a passive-aggressive breakup line. But you're no passive reader now. You can see it, can't you? The way the feathers curl into waves, the subtle direction of the stitch lines, the slight asymmetry that hints at intentional imperfection. These weren't accidents. These were signals. In the same way we now read memes, GIFs, or the choice of an Instagram. Caption: people read silk. You might have worn your heartbreak stitched inside your sleeve, or your hope, or your rage. Silk has memory, after all. It creases along emotional lines. You pause to imagine it, your own story told in silk. What color would it be? What pattern would you choose? What would you risk saying if you knew only the right eyes could hear it? You're crouched in the corner of a candlelit room, somewhere between a dowry chest and a dying potted orchid, watching two women silently judge a third. She sits demurely, head bowed, eyes downcast, but her hands are trembling ever so slightly as she passes over a folded square of crimson silk. This is not some casual arts and crafts check-in. This is a high-stakes inspection, and the embroidery in her lap might as well be her Tinder profile, resume, fertility report, and seduction IQ rolled into one. You're witnessing an ancient matchmaking ritual that might look polite on the surface, but underneath, it's a blood sport. Welcome to the delicate brutality of silk courtship, where a young woman's needlework determined not just her value as a future wife, but her potential as a lover, a mother, and perhaps most importantly, a silent co-conspirator. In the long game of marital survival, this is how grandmothers picked winners. They weren't looking for neat stitches. They were reading the emotional temperature of the silk. The mother-in-law-to-be lifts the cloth and squints. Lotus flowers. Safe, a double fish. Fertility, good, but then a plum blossom in the corner, subtly stitched upside down. Scandalous. That suggests longing, possibly even carnal desire. The girl's chances just jumped from maybe to marry her before someone else does. You wouldn't guess it from the way she clutches her teacup, but she knew what she was doing. Girls were trained in these codes from the moment they could hold a needle. They were told they were learning patience and grace. What they were actually learning was silent storytelling with sharp objects, and they knew how to use it. Think of it like LinkedIn meets Grindr, but embroidered and supervised by elderly women with hawk eyes and a serious distrust of flirty metaphors. One recorded case from the Ming Dynasty tells of a matchmaking ceremony derailed entirely by a rogue butterfly. The bride-to-be's sash featured a pair of butterflies, but they were flying in opposite directions. Her suitor's mother read it as a sign that the couple's destinies were misaligned. Wedding canceled. Months later, the girl eloped with a traveling actor, and the design? Turns out it wasn't a mistake, it was a coded declaration of intent. The butterflies weren't confused. She just wasn't going where they wanted her to. Historians still argue whether this rebellion was part of a wider trend of marital resistance through embroidery, or a rare fluke from a girl with guts and good thread tension. Either way, the record survives. As does the butterfly motif, though now it shows up mostly on decorative pillows and regrettable arm tattoos. Now, let's shift your gaze from brides to brocade. In the wealthier districts, it wasn't enough to simply present embroidery. You had to outdo every other bachelorette in a 5-li radius. Enter the embroidery contest, part beauty pageant, part psychological warfare. One surviving scroll from the Qianlong period shows a legendary competition where noble girls each presented a stitched scene from a love story. The winner? A 16-year-old named Bai Yun, who embroidered the tale of the cowherd and the weaver. Girl classic, tragic, poetic. But here's the kicker. She stitched the weaver girl's tears in silver thread, so fine it shimmered only when the cloth moved, visible only under lamplight. The judges wept. Her intended husband did not. He was too busy weeping into the sleeves of the girl who stitched the jealous magpie with flaming eyes. Embroidery doesn't lie. It reveals what's too dangerous to say aloud. And occasionally, it burns bridges better than fire ever could. Let's pause for something fringe. In certain villages, there was a belief that you could curse a rival's romantic life by hiding an extra stitch in their wedding embroidery, usually something like a moth or a crooked star, small and almost invisible. The moth symbolized decay. The crooked star meant misfortune. If the bride wore it unaware, it was said her husband would never look at her the same way. Superstition? Maybe. But in a world where women couldn't control their fates with laws or swords, slipping a curse into a hem was power. Whisper level. Power, but real all the same. Now, as promised, your sex story of the night. From Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, there's a story of a courtesan named Lan Shi, known for stitching aphrodisiacs into her embroidery. Not literally, though that would be something, but symbolically. Her most famous piece depicted a pair of mandarin ducks bathing under a waterfall. Standard romantic fluff, right? Except the waterfall was suspiciously phallic, and the ducks were anatomically enthusiastic. That piece was gifted to a high-ranking eunuch, which raised more than a few eyebrows and caused one scandalous poem to suggest that even those denied the act may still crave its art. The robe vanished shortly after, but not before inspiring a fashion trend that rippled through pleasure districts from Hangzhou to Guangzhou. Mandarin ducks suddenly found on undergarments, handkerchiefs, even the inside of parasols. People were literally shading themselves with innuendo. This raises another ongoing academic debate. Were these embroidered symbols meant to be read publicly, or were they intended only for the eyes of lovers and close confidants? Some argue the codes were hidden in plain sight, a game of double meanings where plausible deniability was built right in. Others believe the secrecy was more sacred, part of a deeper intimacy shared only in bedrooms or bathhouses. You don't have to choose. Aside, just know that every thread told a story, and every story carried risk. Embroidering your desire onto a robe meant trusting that the reader would understand and not betray you. You take a breath, and the air smells faintly of camphor, stored silk, and something warmer like longing pressed between fabric folds. You realize now that embroidery wasn't just an art form. It was a diagnostic tool for character, a love letter folded into wearable form, and sometimes a slow-motion rebellion against the roles women were told to play. In a society where virtue was measured by silence, women stitched louder than anyone, dared to speak, and maybe, just maybe, they're still speaking. In thrift shops, museum drawers, antique markets, you've probably passed 100 secret confessions without even knowing it. That little peony near the collar, not just pretty, a signal flare. That wonky butterfly in the corner of a child's jacket, maybe stitched by a mother with dreams elsewhere. These aren't relics. They're encrypted heartbreaks. And you? You're learning to read the love letters. You're leaning over a lacquered table in a palace chamber, and your eyes catch something that seems like an accident. A golden chrysanthemum, stitched just slightly askew on the back of an imperial gown. It shouldn't matter, flowers are everywhere in Chinese embroidery, right? But this one is off. Not wrong in technique, no, the petals are perfect. The gold thread practically hums in the lamplight, but wrong in tone. It's alone. It's blooming. Sideways, like it's resisting the pattern, refusing to follow the usual path. You know enough now to sense the rebellion. And you're not the only one. A court eunuch notices too, and for a fleeting second, his gaze hardens not at the flower, but at the empress who wears it. The message isn't missed. It never is. In the rigid etiquette of Qing dynasty court dress, where every thread is regulated, where even the dragons must face the right direction, a chrysanthemum behaving badly is like yelling from under a veil. This one means something. Possibly danger. Possibly desire. Possibly both. Now here's the gossip that never dies. Some say this golden flower was a signature, not of the seamstress, but of the empress herself. Rumor insists that she took up the needle at night when the walls no longer had ears, because even imperial women knew the power of embroidery wasn't just in the beauty, but in the hiding. The chrysanthemum, symbol of autumn, of fleeting life, of reluctant endurance, was her mirror. And it's said, though we can't confirm without time travel, that she sewed that flower as a quiet nod to a lover long disappeared, a court musician exiled for insubordination. Others argue it was never about love, but rivalry. That the flower was a taunt, a way to provoke another concubine who once embroidered chrysanthemums with such vanity. She claimed the gods admired her cuffs. Historians still argue whether the empress was making a romantic confession or a political move. But either way, she stitched it in gold, and gold never whispers. Now let's talk about the flower itself. Chrysanthemums weren't always flirtatious. In much of Chinese poetry and art, they symbolized resilience, scholarly detachment, even the nobility of suffering. But when you stitch them into clothing, especially alone, and especially in forbidden places like under a sleeve or at the nape of the neck, the meaning shifts. They become intimate, secret, a way to say, I'm enduring something, or worse, I'm waiting for someone. In certain regions, women even stitch them into undergarments as part of mourning, not just for lost husbands, but for lost futures. Imagine wearing a flower on your skin, just to keep heartbreak from escaping your bones. There's a tale from the late Ming era of a concubine named Yu Fei, who famously wore a robe with no flowers at all, only one stitched chrysanthemum over her heart. Her patron, a moody bureaucrat known more for poetry than governance, asked her what it meant. She replied, "It's the flower that watches the frost and does not die." He married her, which was both touching and terribly inconvenient for his first wife. But that robe, it became infamous. Other women began requesting mourning florals, and for a short while, it was a trend. Garments that mourned people not yet dead, stitched for relationships that felt like slow funerals. Talk about wearable angst. Let's step sideways into a quirky little detail. During the Qing dynasty, embroidery manuals were often passed hand to hand like forbidden novels. Some included annotations in the margins, scrawled, whispered warnings about which patterns might be too emotional or risk romantic misreading. One note reads, "Avoid lone chrysanthemums unless widowed or immune to gossip." Another suggests mixing chrysanthemums with pine needles to dilute the dangerous implications. Dangerous flowers, who would have thought? And yet, there. It is a simple stitch, capable of starting rumors faster than perfume on a collar. Now your required sex story, straight from Foucault's alley of historical deviance. A scholar bureaucrat named Su Wen kept a private collection of embroidered handkerchiefs, each one allegedly sewn by a different lover. He cataloged them obsessively, noting color, stitch technique, and implied symbolism. One handkerchief made of deep crimson silk featured a single chrysanthemum stitched in dark silver thread. His notes read, "She said it was for her mother. I do not believe her." The woman in question was a minor entertainer from Nanjing who vanished 2 weeks later, sparking rumors of a political scandal. The handkerchief remained, folded between pages of erotic poetry. Su Wen, who later faced exile for unrelated corruption charges, reportedly took the collection with him into the mountains. Some scholars suggest he continued collecting, even in disgrace. Others believe the handkerchiefs were burned in a fit of guilt. Either way, the silver chrysanthemum became infamous, referred to in later plays as the sorrow stitch. And here's a debate that's still echoing in academic circles. Were court embroiderers actively participating in these subversive designs, or merely executing requests without knowing the implications? Some believe that these artisans were silent collaborators, women who understood the secret codes and intentionally exaggerated certain motifs to amplify the message. Others argue they were essentially glorified machines, controlled by patrons with more power than ethics. But there's one known case of an embroiderer named Ping He who was dismissed for too much personality in her stitching. The record doesn't explain what that meant, but fragments of her final robe survive, and they include a chrysanthemum shaped to resemble a flame. Coincidence? You decide. Your mind drifts back to that lonely flower on the imperial robe, the golden defiance stitched where none was allowed. You begin to understand why these choices mattered so deeply. In a world where women's words were monitored, their clothes became novels. Where their desires were regulated, their silks became diaries. And where love was a transaction, embroidery became negotiation. Silk was their syntax, thread their grammar, and flowers like the chrysanthemum long-stemmed, metaphors for what could not be named aloud, were the emotional clauses, hidden between folds. You close your eyes and imagine stitching one yourself, not for a lover, not for grief, just for the moment to say you were here, that you noticed, that you felt something when the world told you to feel nothing at all. Maybe it would be golden, like the empresses, maybe silver, like the courtesan's sorrow, or maybe red, for no reason except that sometimes you just want to burn a little. Beautifully. You open the door to a quiet tea room and walk straight into a war, not one of swords or screams, but of sleeves. Long, flowing, lethal sleeves. The kind that whisper instead of shout. At first glance, everything is serene. Steam curling from porcelain cups, silk drapes barely fluttering against closed windows, and 4 women seated like delicate brushstrokes in an imperial painting. But then you notice the details, how one lady's sleeve just happens to trail slightly closer to the host's teacup than decorum allows. How another's embroidered crane seems to stretch its neck toward her rival's koi, and how the eldest wife's robe flares with a phoenix so vivid, it looks ready to peck out someone's eyes. Welcome to the battlefield of embroidered symbolism, where wives, concubines, and courtesans didn't just compete for affection, they lacerated each other with motifs. No swords drawn, yet reputations died swiftly in that room. And the most dangerous weapon? A sleeve stitched with the right insult, wrapped in silk and smiling all the while. You sit down quietly, unnoticed, but not uninvolved. The lady in blue flicks her sleeve toward you, almost accidentally. A snow lotus peeks out cool, rare, unbothered by the drama. It means, I am above this, which is both a message and a move. The younger concubine to her right, wearing a lighter pink robe embroidered with carp jumping a dragon gate, scoffs so gently it barely counts. That carp, by the way, isn't just about ambition, it's about conquest. She's telling everyone she plans to leap over someone else's place in the household hierarchy, and she's not hiding it. Suddenly, the tea tastes like tension. You're not drinking it, you're drowning in it. Let's rewind to how this visual Cold War began. In many elite households, multiple wives meant multiple egos squeezed under one gilded roof. And when open confrontation was discouraged, because yelling isn't ladylike, and poisoning is frowned upon, women turned to what they wore. Sleeves became power moves, petal placement became subtext, and embroidery evolved into something so sharp it could wound without ever breaking the skin. Think of it as meme warfare in slow motion, stitched over weeks instead of sent in seconds. One scholar describes it as a dialogue of beauty underwritten by menace. Another calls it social chess played with birds and flowers. Take, for instance, the infamous case of Lady Huo and Lady Qin, 2 wives of a mid-ranking court official who were said to loathe each other with a refined elegance only embroidery could express. Lady Huo, the elder, embroidered peonies on her sleeve edges, symbols of wealth and seniority. Lady Qin countered with plum blossoms, resilience, youth, and stubborn charm. For months, the two sat side by side at family banquets, their garments holding full conversations while their mouths remained sweet as syrup. Eventually, Lady Huo stitched a withering peony wrapped in frost under her winter robe, not so subtle jab implying Lady Qin's beauty was wilting. In response, Lady Qin unveiled a summer robe with an open blossom, being visited by a bee. The symbolism was unmistakable. Everyone at the table gasped, except the husband, who predictably noticed nothing. Historians still argue whether this embroidery duel was a display of genius or desperation. Either way, Lady Qin became his favored companion, and Lady Huo developed a chronic headache that kept her in her quarters for the rest of the year. What a weird tidbit. In some households, maids were trained to read the embroidery and adjust the seating arrangements accordingly. Imagine being seated next to someone whose robe tells the room you're a wilted daffodil. That's psychological warfare with tea and cakes. There's even a Qing-era etiquette manual advising women not to wear assertive florals when visiting senior wives, lest they be interpreted as a threat. Assertive florals. That's an embroidered mic drop. And now for the required romance detour. One of the juicier stories from the history of sexuality describes a highborn gentleman named Lost to Time who was forced to mediate between his two lovers, both of whom had stitched their desire into his clothes. One, a courtesan known for her melancholic songs, embroidered a sleeve with falling cherry blossoms, a symbol of transient love and impending loss. The other, a bold merchant's widow, stitched a robe hem with roaring tigers facing forward, a not-so-subtle suggestion of dominance. The man, foolishly, wore both garments to the same dinner. It ended in scandal, snipped hems, and one robe allegedly set on fire. The lesson here? You can't wear two truths at once, not when both are stitched in silk. There's also a deeper question. Academics still chew on. Did women weaponize embroidery as a last resort, or was it always meant to carry power? Some argue embroidery evolved out of necessity, a creative act turned strategic. Others believe it was always about coded speech, that from the earliest dynasties, thread was voice. The moment a girl picked up a needle, she entered a language not meant for men. A language that allowed her to say, "You'll never hear me complain, but look at my sleeves and understand. I see you. I remember, and I am not afraid to sew what I cannot say." And perhaps most beautifully, embroidery let women love each other, or hate each other, without ever raising a hand. It made space for flirtation, warning, revenge, even apology. You find one account of a sister-wife relationship that began with rivalry and ended in rare friendship, stitched out over years. Their final shared robe featured cranes flying in tandem, circling a blooming tree. It's said they presented it together on the day their husband fell ill, a visual gesture of unity. Was it sincere? Was it strategy? Maybe both. Silk doesn't judge it, just records. As you sit in that tea room, surrounded by weaponized sleeves and the slow exhale of boiling water, you begin to appreciate the beauty and danger of speaking in stitches. You think of all the things that couldn't be said aloud, and how, thread by thread, women turned silence into speech. You imagine your own sleeve, quietly fluttering at your side. What would you sew if no one could stop you? A question? A warning? A kiss? You don't answer. You just smile and let the silk speak for itself. You slip behind a folding screen in a scholar's study, expecting ink pots and dusty scrolls, and instead find lingerie. Not the lacy Western kind. No, this is something older, stranger, and far more deliberate. There, laid out like secrets mid-exhale, are silk undergarments so finely stitched they seem to shimmer with breath. Pale jade for tranquility, crimson for desire, soft yellow for intellect. Each piece is embroidered with symbols so subtle they could pass for art, until you realize you're not looking at simple patterns. You're looking at philosophical foreplay. Because once upon a time, Chinese scholars, those weary, ink-stained men we picture buried in Confucian texts, were commissioning their lovers under things like you might order a poem. Personal, symbolic, and designed to seduce not just the body, but the mind. Welcome to the world of erotic intellect, where lust and literature wrapped around each other beneath the robes of the literati. It started, they say, in the Ming Dynasty, when scholars, ever the overthinkers, decided that physical desire needed to be framed through philosophy. Enter the erotic undergarment, lingerie that wasn't just sexy, but clever. A scholar might gift his favored courtesan a stitched bodice bearing plum blossoms and cicadas, not just pretty, but a coded message. The cicada symbolized awakening, rebirth. The plum blossom, perseverance through cold. Translation: your body stirs me from winter's numbness. Honestly, it's poetry you can wear. And in a culture where public flirtation was often taboo, these garments became the stage for the kind of conversation that skirted censors while setting hearts, and occasionally bed curtains on fire. But these weren't just for show. One surviving garment, preserved in a private collection, features a design of waves crashing against a mountain, a Taoist metaphor for harmony between opposites. Yes, but also, let's be honest, a euphemism for certain kinds of motion. Scholars still argue whether these designs were ever meant to be decoded by anyone other than the wearer and the giver. Some say they were private puzzles, gifts of intimacy that doubled as riddles. Others believe the artisans who sewed them were co-conspirators, fully aware of the cheeky messages they were helping smuggle into someone's waistband. And here's a sex story to stitch into your memory. In Sex with Kings, there's a tale of a court scholar named Ren Bo who was so entranced by a courtesan's embroidered chemise that he composed a 32-line poem in its honor, without ever removing it. The chemise was white silk, edged in clouds with two phoenixes circling an invisible sun at the center. Ren claimed it was the most erotic thing he'd ever seen, because it required him to imagine the heat that the sun represented, hidden beneath layers, always out of reach. He wasn't alone in his obsession. That style became known as the absent sun pattern, and dozens of imitators flooded the pleasure districts with knockoff versions. The original? Said to be buried with the courtesan, though others swear it was hidden in a box carved with lotus petals, passed from lover to lover like a relic of holy lust. Now for something fringe. In certain erotic texts of the late Qing era, there's mention of scented embroidery, a technique where herbs or floral oils were woven into the thread so that the garments would release fragrance with body heat. One description claims that a woman's breath could awaken the petals on her hem. Whether that's poetic exaggeration or lost textile technology, we may never know. But imagine the effect: your lover moves, and suddenly her robe exhales. That's not just romance. That's performance art. And yet, for all their sensuality, these garments also carried risk. A concubine caught wearing suggestive embroidery without permission could be punished, even cast out. There's record of a woman named Zhao Yin who wore a pair of slippers embroidered with intertwined vines, a known metaphor for sexual entanglement. Her patron's wife saw them, flew into a rage, and accused her of seduction. Zhao was banished. The slippers were destroyed. The symbolism? Impossible to unsee. Historians still debate whether Zhao intended the message for the wife, or whether she simply misjudged her audience. Either way, the point was made and never forgotten. Which brings us to the most debated point of all. Were these garments a sign of liberation or of deeper entrapment? Some argue they gave women agency, allowing them to communicate desire on their own terms. Others suggest they were just another way for male scholars to intellectualize their own longing, dressing up libido in metaphor to make it palatable. It's possible, of course, that both are true. That the women wearing these robes knew exactly how to use the scholars' symbols against them. That each lotus, each bird, each whispered wave stitched into silk was not a cry of submission, but a game. And they were winning. You picture it now. The scholar, pale and thin-fingered, unwrapping a garment like a scroll, reading it before ever touching the body it adorned. The woman watching, saying nothing, knowing she has already spoken the only language he truly understands. No moans, no pleas, just thread. Just a stitched sigh he'll never forget. And somewhere, folded in a lacquered box, is a sleeve bearing your name. Though no one will know it, but him. It begins with a whisper. Not words, but thread, gliding through silk like breath. The woman sits alone in a sunlit room, her back too. The window, the light catching the curve of her neck. Each movement of her hand is precise, practiced, and archers aim in slow motion. She isn't just stitching flowers. She's writing a warning. Her husband, a merchant of some wealth and significantly less wisdom, has taken a lover, younger, prettier, predictable, but he's also underestimated the woman he married. Tonight, he'll come home to find his favorite pillowcase redone. The old embroidery, plum blossoms, and calligraphy about loyalty ripped out. In its place, a lotus flower, open wide, surrounded by frogs. In Chinese embroidery, the lotus is loaded. It can mean beauty, rebirth, or when paired with frogs, lust and decay. The message isn't just personal, it's public. When the servants change the bedding, they'll see it. When the guests notice at the next tea banquet, they'll whisper. The lover won't be mentioned aloud, but everyone will know. This isn't art. It's vengeance stitched with elegance, delivered in cotton and silence. And yes, the story gets better. It turns out this embroidery wasn't just a marital landmine. It became the inspiration for a play. Written anonymously during the Qing dynasty and performed only in private salons, The Pillowcase Wife tells the tale of a merchant's betrayal and the wife's revenge stitched into every thread of his bed. In the climactic scene, she embroiders not only the symbols of his lust, but a distorted mirror of herself, her eyes closed, her mouth sewn shut. Audiences loved it. The subtext hit harder than any direct insult could. And in time, the tale itself became legend. Not because the wife screamed or demanded justice, but because she embroidered it and let everyone else do the talking. Historians still argue whether the original story is true or just a fable passed between disgruntled wives. But the pillowcase? That survives. Hidden in a museum vault in Hangzhou, rarely displayed, possibly cursed. There's a fringe tradition in certain southern provinces where jilted women stitch cold bedcloths. These are not for comfort. They're deliberately made with dull colors, heavy knots, and stiff fabric, almost uninviting. They're slipped into the husband's bed while he's away, so when he returns, the coldness hits him in the dark. It's not magic. It's emotional design. One cloth even featured a snake coiled beneath lotus petals. Another, more daring, bore two fish swimming apart, one swimming upstream, the other away. The symbolism was too loud to miss. These weren't just declarations of disappointment. They were warnings. You can't warm a bed you've poisoned. And here's your embroidered sex scandal for the night. From the erotic spirit through history, there's the tale of a seamstress named Huaizan, hired to prepare a bridal trousseau for the daughter of a wealthy salt baron. What she delivered was exquisite robes, sashes, veils, all stitched with extraordinary skill. But the undergarments? That's where the story steams. Each piece featured subtle, stylized images of lovers, a crane and a tortoise locked in, an impossible embrace, vines winding into knots that couldn't be untangled, twin dragons curling into a single flame. Erotic, yes, but disguised so masterfully that the groom wouldn't realize until after the wedding night. And he did. Legend has it he was so enthralled, he commissioned Huaizan to design a full set for his mistress. She declined. But not before embroidering a parting gift, a handkerchief bearing a spider devouring a fly. Scholars debate if that handkerchief was ever delivered or burned by the bride. Either way, Huaizan stitched herself into the annals of petty perfection. Let's go deeper. Why embroidery for revenge? Why not break things, scream, confront? Because this was a world where women's voices were controlled, but their hands were not. A woman couldn't accuse her husband publicly without facing shame or dismissal, but she could stitch. And in doing so, she bypassed the censors, the etiquette, the expectation of quiet suffering. Her anger, threaded into a peony or a snake or a blossom deliberately left unfinished, became ignorable. A friend might see it and understand. A rival might see it and flinch. And the man? He'd wear the insult unknowingly, parade it through court or market, announcing to all the world that he'd been outplayed in silk. The academic community has long debated whether these acts of embroidered rebellion count as protest or passive artistry. Some call it domestic expression, others frame it as textile resistance. But let's be honest, if your heartbreak is public, your revenge should be visible. And there's something deliciously wicked about a woman who doesn't scream, doesn't plot, just sews, patiently, quietly, until the whole room sees what she feels. There's even a theory that women developed entire revenge vocabularies. In embroidery, certain patterns became shorthand: broken bamboo for betrayal, wilting peonies for emotional neglect, reversed birds for loneliness. One particularly cutting motif: a cat with its back turned to a sleeping man. That wasn't just shade, that was a threat. And if you're wondering whether the men understood it, probably not. But the women did. Always. There's a final twist to this kind of storytelling. Sometimes, the embroidery wasn't discovered until after the woman had left or died. One diary entry from a 19th century scholar mourns his wife, who he says wore sorrow as prettily as she wore silk. Only after her funeral did he notice that every robe she'd worn in her final year bore the same symbol: a wisteria vine, curling inward, always unfinished. She had been saying goodbye for months. He just didn't know the language. Now he sleeps beside her memory, wrapped in silent goodbyes he can't unread. So you sit there, imagining that pillowcase. The way it must have felt beneath his head. The way the thread must have shifted under his skin with every turn, like a whisper just loud enough to disturb sleep. You understand now, this wasn't just art. It was strategy. It was poetry with teeth. It was a woman taking back control, one stitch at a time. And somewhere, maybe in your own drawer, is a garment that says more than you've ever admitted out loud. A thread, a shape, a symbol only the right eyes will ever truly read. You find yourself in a dimly lit farmhouse on the edge of a misty rice paddy, somewhere deep in 18th century Jiangnan. It's quiet, except for the rhythmic chirp of crickets, and the soft, deliberate sighs of a young woman bent over a low table. Her fingers move with care, her back slightly hunched, eyes focused, lips pressed in a line of stubborn longing. She isn't preparing a dowry robe or copying patterns from a manual. No, what she's doing is far more private. She's stitching a man, not a real one, not yet. A fantasy lover, conjured entirely from memory and desire, sewn into a wedding. Pillow she sleep beside until fate gives her something better, or until the fabric frays with time. And this isn't rare. Across centuries and provinces, girls without suitors, or with too many to choose from, embroidered their imagined husbands into bedding, slippers, or underrobes, not as a joke, as hope, as practice, as comfort. And sometimes, with astonishing anatomical accuracy, you lean in and notice the details: broad shoulders, ink-dark hair, a mouth tilted slightly in amusement. She gives him a scholar's robe, even though she's never spoken to one. She gives him kind eyes, though no man in her village has earned them. And yes, just beneath his belt, there's a suggestion of something more subtle, playful, not obscene, but clear enough to make her blush when she stitches it. This is her secret, her stitch desire. And tonight, she sleep with her cheek against his embroidered chest, whispering thoughts she can't say aloud. It sounds quaint until you realize it's a kind of emotional survival. In a world where women's futures hinged on marriages they didn't choose, stitching your own man was an act of quiet rebellion. You couldn't pick your husband, but you could design one. Here's the part no one talks about. These dream husbands were rarely generic. They often included traits that women longed for, but rarely found: gentleness, patience, hands that looked like they read books rather than held plows or scrolls. One surviving pillowcase from a rural museum in Sichuan features a man with a fan, a dog at his feet, And this is the kicker threaded text above his head that reads, I listen when you speak. He doesn't exist, obviously, but someone wanted him to. And for a girl left alone in her room with nothing but thread and fantasies, that stitched man was real enough. At least until dawn. A fringe practice emerged around this in the late Ming. Period. Night companions. These were not dolls, not exactly. They were bundles of cloth shaped like torsos, covered in embroidered male features, eyes, hair, sometimes even names. Some were gifted by older sisters or aunts. Some were made in secret and hidden beneath mattresses. There's even a recorded ritual where, on the eve of marriage, a girl would burn her night companion as a symbolic farewell to the lover she never had. But others kept them, whispered to them, cried into them. They weren't being foolish. They were being emotionally literate in a world that never taught them how to ask for love in daylight. You want scandal? There's a documented account in Sex with Kings, yes. Even that book makes its way to rural dreams of a merchant's daughter named Liang Mei, who embroidered a full lover's figure onto her bed curtain. He wasn't based on anyone she knew. He was tall, with a moon-shaped face, wearing scholar's robes and holding a lotus. Innocent enough, until a traveling poet glimpsed the curtain while staying in her home and recognized the lotus configuration as a symbol from erotic poetry implying, shall we say, readiness for entanglement. The curtain became infamous. The daughter was briefly banned from temple services. She later married the poet. Make of that what you will, and here's where it gets more complicated. Scholars still debate whether these fantasy embroideries were harmless outlets or quiet acts of defiance. Some label them emotional embroidery, artifacts of suppressed desire with no social consequence. Others argue they were dangerous, that girls who embroidered ideal lovers risked emotional isolation, or even punishment if discovered. But what no one denies is the intimacy. These weren't just patterns. These were prayers stitched in silk. Another story, this one passed down through oral history in a northern village, tells of a girl who embroidered her dream husband with one unusual feature. He had wings. Small, almost imperceptible, folded along his back. No one understood it first, but years later, when she was married off to a cruel older man, her sister found the winged figure again, tucked beneath her old clothes. She asked what it meant. The girl, now a woman, simply said, "He could leave." That one line stitched in thread, then spoken aloud, says more than any poem. Her dream man wasn't just kind. He was free. And that's all she really wanted. Now, here's your embroidered sex story for the night. In Peter Webb's collection of erotic artifacts, there's a wedding pillow preserved in a private estate in Hangzhou. The front features a delicate garden scene, bamboo, plum blossoms, a quiet stream. But on the inside, hidden beneath the outer layer, was a second layer of embroidery visible only when the cloth was pulled back. There, stitched in luminous red silk, was a man and woman entwined, not pornographic, but intimate. The man had the face of a known opera singer. The woman's features were more generic, but the date sewn in the corner matched the bride's wedding night. The implication? She stitched her fantasies into the same pillow where her arranged husband would rest his head. Poetic justice in thread. There's a lingering question, one that hovers like a shadow behind all these stories. Were these dream lovers ever just dreams? Or were they placeholders for real people, real feelings, real possibilities that couldn't be spoken? Maybe both. Because thread, like memory, can blur. You start with fantasy, you end with confession. You start with silk, and you end up revealing a version of yourself no one else is allowed to see. So tonight, you imagine your own pillow. Not the one you sleep on now, but the one you would have stitched if you were there, back then. What would you create? Who would you build in thread? Would you make them strong or soft? Would they hold a book or your hand? Would they have wings? You don't need to answer. Just picture them. Let them appear, as real as breath, as silent as stitches. You hear it before you see it. The quiet crackle of satin rubbing against rough hands, the almost imperceptible gasp of a maid holding her breath as she realizes what she's holding isn't just a robe. It's evidence, a trap. A perfectly innocent garment with one damning detail, a petal. Out of place, out of season, and completely wrong. You're in the private quarters of a Ming Dynasty governor, a man known for his obsession with decorum, reputation, and robes so immaculate they made lesser men sweat in his presence. But tonight, the robe on the floor tells a different story. Not in words, in stitches. A single pink camellia sewn among plum blossoms, a flower that never blooms at the same time, a botanical impossibility. Unless, of course, someone had something. To say someone like a concubine with too much time and too much rage, or a lover feeling bold, or a seamstress paid well and told nothing. The robe was meant to be worn at a court banquet. And it was. The wrong petal was noticed by another official's wife. Her laugh was discreet. Her message, less so. By the time the governor realized the mistake, his enemies already had their metaphor and a reason to smirk behind their fans. The robe became infamous. Not because the embroidery was crude, but because it was brilliant. The camellia, you see, wasn't just an aesthetic error. It symbolized longing, forbidden love, and depending on placement, female infidelity. One version of the tale suggests the governor's favored concubine commissioned the robe as a secret message to her real lover, a traveling painter. Another version insists it was sabotaged by a rival concubine who wanted to ruin the favorite's reputation. Either way, it worked. The robe became a scandal. The concubine vanished, and the painter? Last seen boarding a boat with a new commission and an oddly floral satchel. Historians still argue whether this was a love triangle gone wrong, or a political hit stitched in pastel treachery. Want something even more bizarre? The robe survives. Tucked away in a lesser-known collection in Suzhou, it's displayed under neutral lighting with a vague plaque. But if you look closely, really closely, you can find that camellia still there. Still slightly smug. Like it knows what it did. Let's go deeper into the scandal. Embroidery in the Ming Dynasty had become not just fashion but currency. Wealthy men used it to display virtue, order, and control. Every robe was a walking resume. Every flower a statement. So when embroidery went rogue, it hit harder than a scandalous poem or a servant's rumor. A misplaced stitch was enough to suggest a misplaced heart. And for a governor, that was dangerous. It wasn't just about gossip. It was about power. Control unraveled with thread. And here's your erotic thread for the night. In Sex with Kings, there's a wonderfully messy story of a high-ranking official who kept a private silk collection embroidered by his lovers. But one day, a robe surfaced in his household with a hidden panel stitched into the lining visible only when turned inside out. It depicted two lovers in silhouette beneath a flowering camellia tree. The male figure had a distinctive beard, the same style worn by the official himself. The woman's identity was never confirmed. But once word got out, everyone had a theory. His second wife, his calligraphy tutor, his male attendant. The robe vanished mysteriously, but not before causing two resignations, one mysterious illness, and a new rule in his estate banning ornamental flora below the waistline. Subtle. Here's a fringe practice you'll enjoy. During the late Ming era, some seamstresses began stitching shadow patterns into underlayers designs that only became visible when the fabric was stretched or dampened. On the surface, a robe might feature innocent cranes and clouds, but underneath, camellias, butterflies, vine symbols of erotic longing, stitched in silk so fine they whispered against the skin. These robes weren't sold publicly. They were commissioned, quietly, expensively, and often by women. who wanted to wear secrets under their silence. One account speaks of a lady-in-waiting who wore such a robe to court. No one noticed, until the emperor, catching a glimpse as she bent to pour tea, saw something he shouldn't have. He ordered the robe removed and studied. The result? The seamstress was arrested, but not punished. Instead, she was reassigned to the emperor's private wardrobe. Some threads are too skilled to waste, even when they embarrass an empire. There's a larger question here, one still debated by textile historians and gossip mongers alike. Were these embroidery scandals deliberate acts of rebellion, or just accidents interpreted through the lens of paranoia and patriarchy? Some argue women used embroidery to fight back in a world where power was always elsewhere. Others suggest we're reading too much into misplaced petals. But really, is there such a thing as an innocent camellia in the wrong season? When everything else is plum? That's the tension embroidery always carried. It looked delicate, but it was precise. It looked silent, but it shouted in metaphor. A flower wasn't just a flower. A missing thread wasn't just a mistake. These garments became maps of feeling, diaries and code, and sometimes time bombs waiting to bloom. You imagine holding the robe now, feeling the silk between your fingers, knowing that what you're touching once destroyed someone's reputation, maybe broke a heart, maybe saved one. You can't ask it for answers, but you don't need to. The camellia's still there, still blooming wrong, still perfectly stitched. There's a woman pacing the edge of a lacquered balcony under a moon as sharp as a blade, her robe whispering around her ankles like restless gossip. She's alone, but not unseen. Inside the palace walls, eyes are everywhere, spies in silk slippers, lips stitched shut with duty. But this woman is no ordinary court lady. She is the danger everyone pretends not to notice, the breeze you think is harmless until it knocks over everything you built. And tonight, she's wearing a shawl stitched with roses. Not just any roses, these are blooming in unnatural formation, arranged like stars on a secret map. You wouldn't know it unless you'd been trained. Unless you too were part of the embroidery guild, because yes, there was a guild. A real, hidden network of women who stitched not just pretty flowers, but coded messages. Love letters, political secrets. Intelligence that could bring down dynasties, all disguised as floral flair. And tonight, that rose-covered shawl is a declaration of intent. A secret being carried on fabric through the corridors of power, right under the emperor's nose. It sounds like a spy movie, but it was real. The Qing dynasty was a period of elaborate espionage, and while the official networks were dominated by eunuchs and bureaucrats, the most invisible agents were women specifically. Women with needles, seamstresses, handmaids, daughters of fallen generals sent to serve in imperial households. They were underestimated, ignored, trusted to handle silk and satin, yet never considered capable of treason, which made them perfect. Because when you're invisible, no one questions the patterns you sew into a hemline. No one suspects that the vines on a lady's scarf might be a map of troop movements, or that the color sequence on a sleeve might be a signal to rebels hiding in plain sight. Historians still argue how widespread the practice was, but one thing's clear: embroidery was not just art, it was a weapon. One legend tells of a court lady named Aro who became the most feared and most admired embroiderer in the Forbidden City. She worked in the Empress Dowager's inner circle, producing garments so exquisite they were said to bring good fortune just by wearing them. But Aro had a secret. Her stitches carried double meanings. A peony might indicate the presence of spies. A crane in flight might mean the emperor was vulnerable. These messages were passed from palace to palace, coded into sleeves and collars and fans. One of her most famous works, a robe gifted to a Mongol envoy, featured a phoenix with a broken tail interpreted by those who knew the code as the empire is fracturing. The envoy returned home and changed his position on war. The robe vanished. A-Row disappeared a year later. Her name lives on, whispered in quiet corners of textile museums and conspiracy forums. Now for your mandatory seduction tale. This one from the erotic spirit through history. A noblewoman in the 18th century, bored with her loveless marriage, and increasingly curious about her sister-in-law's mysterious new handmaid, began receiving gifts. Small ones, a sachet embroidered with lily, a ribbon bearing a barely there dragonfly, a veil so sheer it practically disappeared when worn. Nothing overt, nothing offensive. But inside each item was a pattern, an intentional placement of petals or wings or knots. Over time she decoded them. Messages, flirtations, an invitation. Eventually, a shawl arrived, stitched with twin swallows facing one another in midair. In that era, it meant only one thing. I desire you, and I do not fear the fall. What happened next was never recorded officially, but personal letters suggest the noblewoman took to wearing the shawl during walks in the garden. Always at dusk, always alone, always waiting. Some silk tells stories. Some silk makes them happen. And then there's the fringe stuff, the deep lore. Some say certain women were trained from birth to sew in code, using family symbols, ancient runes, or Taoist sigils that could mean anything. From I miss you to poison is in the tea. One document recovered from a burned estate shows diagrams of embroidery with annotations, like flower 3 equals message accepted, and rotate butterfly wing equals delay the meeting. It's espionage disguised as decor. And the more you learn, the more you realize how terrifyingly clever it all was. But the most haunting tale of all belongs to a dancer. She wasn't a spy, not officially. Just a performer with perfect posture, and a gown that shimmered too much for comfort. Her fans were embroidered with clouds, her scarves with tigers. No one questioned it, until a foreign diplomat died mysteriously after watching her perform. The cause? Undetermined. But one servant swore he saw her hand the man a kerchief embroidered with a red sun, partially eclipsed by a black circle. When decoded, that pattern could be read as a warning. Do not rise, or worse, you will not rise again. Coincidence? Perhaps. But that style of embroidery was banned shortly after. And the dancer was never seen again. So, you're probably wondering, how do we know any of this? Because some patterns survived. Some garments somehow were kept, smuggled, buried, passed down. Scholars have cataloged dozens of designs they believe carried messages, though interpretations vary. Some say we're reading too much into it. Others insist we're still underestimating the women who stitched these clues into history. But imagine this. You're holding a robe from 1753. You run your fingers over the embroidered birds and flowers, and suddenly it hits you. This isn't just decoration. This is a conversation. A secret, a warning, a confession. And you're the only one still listening. You step back onto the balcony with the woman. She adjusts her shawl. The roses glint red under the moonlight. A servant passes, eyes down, pretending not to see. Across the courtyard, a lantern flickers twice once, then again. She nods. Somewhere, someone understands the message. And just like that, history changes. The room smells like ink and jasmine. And something else, something sharp and earthy, like old wood hiding secrets. You sit in the corner, trying not to blink too loudly, because across from you sits a woman with a needle like a sword and a gaze like a challenge. She isn't a concubine or a bride or even a lady-in-waiting. She's a guild sister, and this isn't just embroidery, it's initiation. The Red Thread Room, they call it a half-mythical society of women who stitch not for husbands or court fashion or even rebellion, but for identity, for truth, for each other. They don't ask who you love, they ask what you want to stitch. And tonight, you'll find out what that means, because in this room, the thread you pull might change everything. The guild was rumored to begin sometime during the Song dynasty, born out of frustration, whispers, and far too many women sewing the same meaningless patterns while hiding whole selves beneath silk collars. It was a quiet revolution, a refusal to be decorative. Women from every rank, maids, courtesans, scholars' daughters, came together in secret, bringing scraps of silk and scraps of themselves. They stitched birds that flew in pairs, even when society said women must fly alone. They stitched eyes into hidden seams, watching the world that refused to see them. And in the most daring pieces, they stitched lovers, two women reclining under a willow tree, or dancing cranes with wings interlocked in unmistakably intimate tangles. It wasn't pornographic, it was liberation. They didn't need permission. They needed thread. One recovered robe, hidden in a false bottom of a dowry chest, and now in a museum archive, features a koi leaping over a moon, not a traditional symbol, but one invented by the guild. The koi represents transformation, aspiration. The moon, feminine energy, and secrecy. Together, they mean a woman reaching for her true self, not her husband's version, not her society's, hers. That robe was passed from woman to woman, worn in secret meetings, until it fell apart from love. The last woman to wear it stitched her initials into the hem in red thread, backwards, so only those in the guild would know how to read it. Here's the sex story you didn't expect. From the history of sexuality, a tale emerges of a seamstress named Mulan who joined the guild not for freedom, but for survival. She'd fallen in love with a high-born girl, the daughter of her employer. They were discovered. Of course, no one in such houses stays quiet for long. Mulan fled with only the robe she'd stitched for her beloved, hiding their initials in the corner of a phoenix wing. The guild found her, gave her work, and renamed her Fourth Sister, as was their custom. Over time, she embroidered a robe entirely in metaphors for their love, interwoven vines, stars reflected in ponds, a pair of rabbits facing the same direction. It was worn by a guild leader during the autumn festival parade, right under the noses of magistrates and priests. No one noticed, except one old lady who saw the rabbits and nodded once, very slowly. There's power in being seen like that, even for a second. Want something fringe? The guild had a ritual known as turning the thread. On the 7th night of the 7th month, the night of the cowherd and weaver girl, the mythic lovers separated by the Milky Way, they would gather in silence and each stitch a single line on a communal robe. No one spoke, no one explained. But if you looked close enough, you'd see it. Broken hearts, bound wrists, eyes closed in longing, hands reaching across invisible distances. The robe was never finished. That was the point. Love like theirs never got a neat ending. The red thread room wasn't about defiance alone. It was also about safety. In a world where most women were punished for wanting anything outside of what men gave them, the guild offered shelter. A place to tell the truth, not just in words, but in color and cloth. If you were lonely, you could stitch a peach just starting to rot. If you were angry, you could sew clouds with sharp edges. If you were in love, truly in love, you could stitch another woman's name in code beneath a peony leaf and know someone else in the room would see it and smile and say nothing. Of course, not everyone approved. One Confucian scholar wrote a whole pamphlet condemning threaded perversions, claiming that embroidery should elevate the virtues of obedience and chastity, not encourage fantasies of chaotic affection. Guess how many women stitched his name into a donkey's rear in protest? At least 22, that we know of. One even included the line, he prefers needles in haystacks because truth pricks too hard. Anonymous, of course. The best jokes always are. Historians still debate the extent of the guild's network. Some claim it was limited to Jiangnan. Others believe there were branches in nearly every major city. What they agree on is that the embroidery styles that came out of these spaces were unique, less symmetrical, more layered, full of shadows and secondary motifs that only made sense if you knew the code. It was art that told a story you had to work to understand, like love, like identity. You picture it now. A narrow room lit by oil lamps, red thread stretched between fingers like fate. A girl sewing her truth into the hem of a handkerchief she'll never let anyone else use. A woman stitching her grief into the lining of a scarf she wear to her wedding. Another threading joy into a corner of a curtain she hang only when her lover visits. None of them speaking. All of them speaking. You can't join the guild. It's long gone, or maybe it isn't. Maybe someone somewhere is still stitching red threads into the unseen corners of the world, still daring to say, "This is who I am," without waiting for permission. Maybe you've passed one of their works already on a hand-me-down shawl, or an antique handkerchief, or that strangely powerful scarf in your grandmother's drawer. You'd only know if you looked closely. And now, you know how you're standing in a bridal chamber, but there's no joy in the air, only smoke from the incense and a kind of stifled silence. Like even the silk doesn't want to be here. The room is a crimson cage, red walls, red candles, red sheets. And at the center of it all, a woman dressed in the finest embroidery money could command. Dragons 5-clawed, gold-threaded, defiant coil across her sleeves and down the hem of her robe. They breathe fire into the silence, and you understand instantly. These are not wedding dragons. They're not symbols of unity or fertility. They're not stitched to charm a husband. They're stitched to replace him. You're watching a woman who has decided not to wait for rescue, not to weep into veils. This is a trousseau of refusal. This princess has chosen dragons, not husbands. And the needle that stitched them was a sword no one saw coming. Her name was Princess Jisoo, youngest daughter of an emperor who treated his daughters like pawns carved from jade. Marriage was her duty, her dowry a performance. She was expected to smile, bow, and disappear into someone else's lineage. But she had other plans. When told to prepare her bridal wardrobe, she locked herself in her embroidery chamber for 40 days. The court was pleased finally. She's acting like a proper woman, they said. She emerged with robes so magnificent the empress herself wept. But no one looked closely. No one noticed that instead of paired ducks or lotus blossoms, her trousseau featured dragons solo, soaring, spitting fire, chasing nothing but wind. On the wedding day, her groom reached for her hand and saw the dragon's eye on her sleeve staring back. Cold, unblinking, she never touched him. She never bore children. She never explained. And no one dared ask. The story could have ended there. But of course, it didn't. One night, a maid reported that Jiaxu cut up her wedding robe and rewove it into a wall hanging, now lost, titled, "Sons of No Man." According to whispers, it showed 3 dragons circling a flame. In traditional iconography, dragons chasing a pearl symbolize ambition. But a flame? That was new. That was dangerous. Some say it represented her own heart burning, sovereign, untouchable. Others believe it was a prophecy, that she intended to start a fire no empire could contain. Historians still debate whether Jiaxiu's embroidery was personal catharsis or political provocation. What's certain is that after her death, her robes vanished, and no other princess was ever permitted to design her own trousseau again. Let's weave in your required seduction. One of the few court accounts that escaped censorship describes a rare audience between Jiaxiu and a female poet from the south, a woman famous for her verses about longing and moonlight. The poet was invited to admire the embroidery, not the kind on scrolls, but on Jiaxiu's underrobe, hidden beneath the layers she wore to court. They met in private, candlelight flickering over brocade. Jiaxiu revealed a sleeve lined with thread so dark it shimmered violet, and stitched upon it a pair of phoenixes mid-fight, wings frayed, claws extended, not mating, but colliding. The poet, it said, touched the embroidery only once, then wrote 17 lines of verse about a love too bright to share the sky. The poem was, "Burned, the robe hidden." But a single surviving line remains on a scrap of silk. Her dragons left no room for kings. Do with that what you will. Now for the fringe detail that gets buried in footnotes. In some regions, particularly around Chengdu, unmarried noble women were quietly allowed to stitch guardians into their dowries, small mythical creatures, meant to protect the heart in marriage. Most chose unicorns, birds, or turtles. Jiaxu chose dragons. And not just any dragons, she invented her own species, with double pupils, twisted horns, and tails that coiled into question marks. According to the palace tailor, she said only this: "I will not be eaten." That's not embroidery. That's a manifesto. And yes, the dragons had meanings. Dragons facing left represented defiance. Dragons without whiskers were female. Dragons chasing fire instead of pearls were seekers of truth, not power. Jiaxiu's robes contained all three. She stitched a world where her spirit ruled her body, where no hand could claim her unless it earned her fire. Some called it madness. Some called it brilliance. The guild called it art. One surviving seamstress said, "We did not know what she was making, but when it was finished, we wept." And the big debate? Did Jiaxiu's embroidery spark wider rebellion? Some claim her patterns were copied by court women in secret, that dragons began to appear in the underlayers of gowns, in corners of cushions, hidden beneath peonies and clouds like a second subversive narrative. Others say she was a one-off, too bold, too alone, her message misunderstood. But her legend grew, fueled by rumors, stitched into lullabies and lantern riddles. In the poetry salons of Hangzhou, there's still a riddle. What beast is no bride, no leash, no pearl, but burns its own path across heaven? The answer whispered, Jiaxiu's dragon. You imagine her now sitting in that embroidery room, surrounded by red silk and silence. Everyone outside thinking she's preparing to vanish into matrimony. And inside, she's drawing the first curve of a claw, the glint of an eye, a tail coiling like smoke. She stitches her no, her enough, her I will not. And you? What would you stitch if no one could stop you? What creature would you summon from thread, not to please, not to seduce, not to win, just to burn in all the right places? You walk into a room that smells like cinnamon, opium, and old perfume, the scent of secrets preserved in silk. It's late. The candles burn low, and the air buzzes with the kind of mischief you can't name but instantly feel. You're not supposed to be here, of course. This is the upstairs salon of a merchant's mansion turned playground, where wives with too much time and not enough attention gather not to gossip, but to unveil what they've been stitching in silence. No, not slippers or pillowcases. Sleeves. Just sleeves, detached, displayed, traded like love letters. And not just any sleeves, these are embroidered fantasies. Personal erotica rendered in peony threads and jade-colored silk. Welcome to the Erotic Sleeve Fan Club. And before you judge, know this: these women were not bored. They were brilliant, clever, starved of affection and freedom. Yes, but absolutely fluent in the art of turning thread into seduction, and loneliness into subversion. Each sleeve is a story. One features mandarin ducks with knowing eyes, beaks, touching in a way that implies much more than avian affection. Another shows a garden path winding into a grove where no footsteps lead back. And then there's the scandalous favorite, a sleeve where clouds part to reveal two celestial beings clothed only in stardust, hands cupped around a glowing pearl, eyes locked in eternal orbit. It was stitched by a magistrate's wife who hadn't spoken to her husband in 4 years. He never asked why her sewing circle met twice a month without fail. If he had, maybe he'd know why her sleeves never matched her robes. This wasn't a hidden sorority. It was a quiet revolution of aesthetics. These women wives, concubines, sometimes even widows, would gather to admire, critique, and occasionally reenact the embroidered stories they passed around. Some sleeves were gifts, others declarations. A few were returned with subtle alterations, like a stitched signature saying, "Message received. Do continue." Historians still argue whether these circles were purely artistic or subtly romantic. Some claim they were platonic showcases of imagination. Others insist, based on coded diary entries and scandalous confessions, that they were the center of same-sex desire in elite households. Either way, the stitching didn't lie. The thread. Always new. Let's talk about one particularly infamous sleeve, the fan behind the lotus. From a distance, it looks innocent, just a woman holding a fan in a lotus garden. But up close, the fan's shadows are shaped like a man kneeling. The woman's robe is slightly off-shoulder, the lotus petals pointed suggestively. The symbolism? Crystal clear. A scholar who viewed it at a private collection called it the most intellectually stimulating arousal I've ever experienced. That scholar later lost his position for over-frequenting embroidery salons. Unrelated? Historians decline to comment. Now your mandatory sex tale, courtesy of Foucault's long-shadowed archives. A widow in Suzhou, known only as Lady Shen, hosted a sleeve exhibition that doubled as a matchmaking party, not for marriage, but for intellectual companionship. Her guests included poets, dancers, even a former nun who embroidered a sleeve depicting a river that flowed in a perfect spiral. Interpretation? Desire with no beginning or end. Lady Shen gifted her a sleeve, in return featuring two cats curled under moonlight, their tails entangled. They became inseparable. The cats became a motif that year, showing up across sleeves in the city. That's how fast ideas stitch themselves into fashion. And here's a deliciously fringe detail. Some women stitched in scented threads, rosewater, sandalwood, even rare oils mixed into the dye. The result? Sleeves that released fragrance with warmth. Imagine the intimacy, leaning close to admire a pattern and suddenly inhaling its hidden meaning. Some scents meant look again, others, I'm watching. The rarest? A citrus-lavender mix said to symbolize secret longing. One surviving example, kept in a museum vault and never displayed due to fragility, still faintly smells if you press your cheek against it. That cheeky whisper from a century ago, still hanging in the air. But not everyone approved. Confucian scholars, always ready to ruin a good time, condemned the sleeve clubs as frivolous distractions that weakened feminine virtue. One even wrote a pamphlet comparing erotic sleeves to caterpillars on the soul. It was widely mocked. Someone, perhaps from the club itself, stitched a parody sleeve featuring caterpillars lounging on silk couches, sipping wine. That sleeve now hangs in a private home with a single line embroidered in gold. Judge not, lest your wife be watching. The debate continues today. Were these sleeves mere fantasy, or were they confessions stitched in code? Were they tools of rebellion or therapy for women denied touch and voice? The answer, of course, is yes. They were all of that and more. They were invitations, boundaries, jokes, poems, dreams. Some were stitched in longing, others in defiance. A few in revenge, but none of them were meaningless. Silk never is, not when it's made with breath held between every stitch. And what did the men think? Most never noticed. A sleeve's embroidery was considered feminine frill, background noise to more important matters. But some did notice. Some tried to interpret, to correct the meanings. One courtier confiscated his wife's entire collection, thinking it immoral. She divorced him 3 months later, a rare but glorious case of poetic justice. Another man reportedly requested his mistress embroider her fantasies for him. She did, in such detail that he moved to a monastery 2 weeks later. One friend whispered that the sleeve's final scene involved a bridge, a mirror, and a tiger with human eyes. Make of that what you will. You're holding a sleeve now. Just a replica, but the weight of it feels strange, like it remembers something. You run your fingers over the stitched clouds, the curving vines, the koi shape in the corner that could be a butterfly or a bare shoulder, depending on how you tilt it. You breathe in, faint rose, fainter sandalwood, and suddenly you understand. This wasn't just embroidery, it was language. And somewhere, someone is still fluent. So tell me, if you were to stitch your own sleeve, your own quiet truth, masked as art, what would it show? A garden with no path? A bird mid-flight with no sky? Or maybe just two hands brushing in a field of silver thread, forever almost touching? Whatever it is, don't say it. Stitch it. It starts in silence, but not the peaceful kind. It's the silence of stone halls and incense-heavy temples where women kneel until their bones ache and their thoughts wander dangerously far. You're in a sacred silk chamber, now deep inside a Taoist temple where no man is allowed past the gates after sundown. But don't be fooled by the stillness. These women are not just praying, they're stitching. And the cloth in their hands? It's not meant for the altar, it's meant for the body, and maybe even the soul, depending on who's reading it. You're about to learn how silkworms, sacred rituals, and erotic metaphor wrap themselves into temple embroidery so layered, with meaning that practically glows with desire and devotion at the same time. Welcome to the place where love is sacred, sensuality is sacrifice, and silkworms are sex symbols. Yes, really. Let's start with the silkworm itself. In ancient Chinese cosmology, the silkworm was associated with feminine energy, transformation, and devotion. It gives its life to produce silk, a creature that spends itself into disappearance. Sound familiar? That metaphor didn't go unnoticed. In temple communities of women spiritual sisters, widows, or those who renounced marriage, the act of raising silkworms became more than economic. It was devotional, and the embroidery they made from that silk, a reflection of their inner life, their longing, and sometimes their unspoken love. One wall hanging preserved in a Taoist archive depicts a single cocoon cracking open, not with wings emerging, but with a burst of fire. Transformation not into flight, but into flame. Historians argue, was it divine ecstasy or erotic rebirth? The stitcher never said. She didn't have to. Here's a tale that lingers like perfume. A novice, named Lian, sent to the temple after refusing marriage, stitched a silk panel so intricate that its imagery is still debated. On one half, the stages of a silkworm's life, meticulously rendered. On the other, a woman in meditation, her posture dissolving into vines, her hands blooming into petals. Her silk robe swirled open at the edges, revealing not flesh but more thread, as if her body was becoming the cloth itself. Visitors gasped. The abbess declared it an allegory for spiritual surrender. But the senior weaver whispered differently. That's how she sees love. The panel was never displayed again, but it wasn't destroyed. It was kept and viewed, and passed hand to hand on certain nights when the moonlight was just right. Here's your erotic stitch for the evening, drawn from Peter Webb's gleefully detailed archive. A widow named G, having taken semi-monastic vows, continued to sleep with a former servant, her only lover, and, as she wrote in a hidden letter, the only man who never touched my body without reading it first. She stitched him a robe plain on the outside, simple brown silk, but on the inside, a hidden lining embroidered with a silkworm's path, spiraling across his chest and lower abdomen. The thread used was dyed with saffron, rose oil, and a drop of her own blood. She told him, "Now you wear my becoming." He wore the robe until it disintegrated. The story survived because he re-embroidered the pattern onto a scroll as a kind of love letter. It still exists. You can look at it today. If you know the right curator. And the fringe belief that silkworms, when tended with reverence and emotion, could carry a woman's intentions into the thread. Not in a spooky magical way, but in the tactile truth that every cocoon, every reel, every knot came from her hands. Some temple women believed the silk itself held the emotional memory of the maker, which means every robe, every sash, every banner wasn't just beautiful, it was haunted. Not by ghosts, by feelings. There was a festival once held in the 3rd month, where these women would unveil their embroidered banners not to worship gods, but to honor the silk, a parade of metaphors. Swans made of fire, trees that bore hearts instead of fruit, rivers that ran upward. One particularly controversial banner showed a pair of silkworms circling one another endlessly, neither cocooning, neither dying, just spinning each other into eternity. It was quietly removed after a visiting monk described it as aggressively mystical, which is probably the most poetic accusation you could make about embroidery. And yes, men knew, some at least. A few temple donors collected the works. One scholar priest wrote essays about the sacred femininity of spun transformation. Another just kept his favorite banner hanging over his bed. One line from his journal reads, "She weaves what she cannot name, and I sleep under her silence." So, here's the debate still stirring among academics. Were these temple embroideries true spiritual expressions, or erotic metaphors hidden in religious camouflage? Was the silkworm a symbol of selflessness, or a quiet rebellion against the expectation that women must disappear to be pure? As usual, the answer is not either or. It's both and. Because silk is always more than silk when it's made by hands that ache with longing. You picture yourself there now, in a stone-walled room where women sit shoulder to shoulder, not speaking, just stitching. Each breath held between threads, each movement carrying centuries of meaning. You look down at your own hands, now holding a square of silk soft as thought. What would you stitch? A cocoon breaking open? A flame that looks like a kiss? A silkworm curled into a question mark? Number. Need to decide tonight. Just let the thread pull through your fingers. Let it say what your lips can't. Let it remember everything for you. Long after your words are gone, you walk into a courtyard at dusk and something's off. Not wrong, just off. The air feels warmer than it should, like it's holding its breath. The lanterns are already lit, casting soft amber pools across the polished stone floor. And there, like a painting that stepped out of itself, sit 3 women in identical robes, same peony print, same jade buttons, same gold embroidery curling along the hem like smoke. You blink, once, twice. No, you're not imagining it. They're all married to the same man. And they're all wearing a matching symbol stitched into their sleeves, 2 blooming peonies wrapped around a single stem. It's not a declaration of submission, it's a power move. Because these aren't rival wives clawing for affection in silence. These are co-conspirators stitching their polyamory into public space, forcing every whisper to reorient itself. You're witnessing embroidered disruption in real time. The man, a well-fed merchant from Hangzhou, married his first wife young. She was clever, educated, excellent with numbers. The second, 10 years later, came from a family of artisans, beautiful and better with people. The third was a dancer, said to move like smoke and read poetry backwards for fun. Instead of dividing them, he built them a shared home with separate wings and one giant embroidery hall where they could work together. Most men would have left. It there placated each wife with private gifts, kept things civil and surface deep. But these 3? They started something different. They began stitching their unity into their clothes. Not just harmony, not just peace, pride. They made robes, sashes, fans all bearing the same floral code. 3 blossoms in full bloom, no wilt, no shadow. A silent scream of, yes, we're sharing him. And no, we're not embarrassed. The city didn't know what to do. Rumors bloomed like mold in summer heat. Was it a performance? A scandal? A strategy? Historians still argue whether the whole affair was genuine affection or a carefully orchestrated survival pact. But here's what's undeniable. The embroidery became contagious. Within weeks, Other wives started experimenting, coordinating colors, symbols, even seasons. You might spot two women at a banquet with matching cuffs and guess, correctly, that they shared a husband and maybe something more. The embroidery told you everything without a single word. Here's your required sex story. This one recorded in a Qing-era journal titled Whispers Between the Seams. It details a dinner party where the three wives were present, dressed as usual, in matching robes. A guest asked too casually what it was like to compete for the same man. The first wife smiled, leaned forward, and showed the inside of her sleeve. Stitched there, so faint it could only be seen by candlelight, were 3 rabbits leaping in a circle. "You think we're chasing him," she said. "But maybe he's just running to keep up with us." Later that night, it said, the guest found a similar rabbit motif embroidered onto the handkerchief left in his coat pocket. No note, just thread. He left at dawn, looking dazed and deeply reevaluative. Let's go fringe for a moment. In some areas, especially around Suzhou, triple wife embroidery evolved into a genuine folk tradition. Not widespread, but persistent. Stitching groups popped up not just for married trios, but for women exploring communal domesticity. Some motifs became standardized. Overlapping lotus flowers for shared emotional labor, interwoven vines for non-hierarchical love, and cranes flying in synchronized formation for households that rejected jealousy entirely. One preserved piece shows a dragon with 3 heads breathing one continuous flame embroidered onto a bedrunner, no less. The symbolism is ... potent ... But here's the nuance. These weren't utopias. Not all triads worked. Some fell apart. Some fought like tigers behind the seams. But the embroidery always told the truth. When things soured, the stitches did 2 flowers half closed. Birds flying in opposite directions. Branches breaking mid-pattern. That's the eerie beauty of silk. It captures what's felt even when no one dares say it out loud. You could walk into a home, glance at the curtain motif, and know someone's sleeping alone this week. Academics debate whether these polyamorous stitchings were expressions of freedom or performance. Did the women love each other or just need each other? Were they rebelling or adapting? Maybe both. Maybe the needle doesn't care why you hold it. It only records how you feel when you do. What's more fascinating is how their embroidery started appearing in places it shouldn't. A widow in Xi'an stitched 3 peonies onto her funeral robe. A concubine requested a wedding sash with 3 cranes instead of 2. One unmarried woman embroidered a bedsheet with a single flower flanked by 2 shadows never explained. Just ... Left there. An echo in thread ... And what about the man in the center of it all? According to one source, he eventually became a footnote in his own story. The wives took over the household's social affairs. They hosted poetry readings, organized embroidery exhibitions, and once held a lunar banquet where guests were asked to guess which sleeve belonged to which wife. No one could, because the truth was, they'd stopped needing to be distinguished. Their love, whether platonic, romantic, or simply practical, wasn't about division anymore. It was about design, collective, continuous. You picture the courtyard again. The 3 women sitting close, sipping tea, their sleeves brushing, as they laugh. Maybe one's in love, maybe 2, maybe none. It doesn't matter. The embroidery matters. The choice. The audacity to say, we made this work and we wore it, so the world would have to learn a new vocabulary. So if you were to design your own polyamorous emblem, not for show, but for truth, what would it be? 3 stars in orbit. A braid that never frays? A garden with no walls? Whatever it is, don't explain it. Stitch it. Let the silk speak first. You're standing at the edge of a desolate coastline, watching waves gnaw at rocks with the slow determination of exile. Everything smells like salt and moss and secrets that never got to bloom. Somewhere behind you, Bells from a temple ring too softly to be comforting. And right now, you're staring at a dancer stepping onto a crumbling stage set up in the courtyard of a provincial governor's estate. She moves with elegance, yes, but also urgency. Like every motion has to count before she disappears again. Her robe is bright under the gray sky, too bright for a place built on punishment and forgetting. You can't take your eyes off it, because stitched across her back, coiled between peonies and cranes, is a poem in thread. A poem written by a man who hasn't been seen in years. A poet. A lover. A traitor. Banished. And somehow his words are now dancing across silk, right in front of the man who exiled him. You're watching an act of defiance disguised as a performance. Love wrapped in beauty, stitched into revenge. Let's rewind. The poet was named Shen Rui, acclaimed in the capital for verses that curled like incense smoke and made grown men weep. He got too close to the wrong truth or the wrong woman. Maybe both. It depends which court records you read. He was exiled for seditious metaphor, which is code for he said something we didn't like, and it rhymed. His lover, a court attendant named Zhu Lian, was left behind. For months. She sent letters, no replies. Then the letters stopped. And then one day, she commissioned a robe. A dancer was paid to wear it during a spring festival. The design was elaborate, but to the untrained eye, just decorative. Plum blossoms, cranes in flight, a mountain. But anyone who knew Shen Rui's poetry recognized the arrangement. It wasn't random. It was a perfect replication of a band. Stanza he wrote just before exile. Plum in snow. I watch crane above the red cliff. My ink runs out, but my longing flies. Julianne didn't speak. She didn't write. She embroidered. The governor saw it. Everyone did. The dancer twirled, and every forbidden word moved with her. It was subtle enough to escape censure, but sharp enough to cut. And sharpest of all, the dancer's inner robe. Hidden under the performance garment was a second layer black silk, with silver embroidery, two hands reaching across a chasm, never touching. It wasn't shown publicly, but later, when the dancer was questioned in private, she revealed it. She said, "The wind carried him away, but I still wear his silence." Your obligatory sex tale is fittingly complicated. According to Asterisk, the erotic spirit through history Asterisk, Shen Rui and Zhu Lian had a habit of sharing poetry through textiles. Not scrolls, clothing. In their earlier years, they exchanged handkerchiefs, collars, even shoe linings stitched with verses. One such artifact survives. A narrow belt embroidered with couplets too intimate to mistake for platonic. But hidden. Among them is a single thread in gold, woven deliberately loose. Pull it, and a secret pocket opens. Inside, a fragment of her hair tied around a seed pearl. Shen Rui wrote once, "I carry her not in my heart, but in the curve of my hip." That quote got him banned from 5 noble households. The belt? Stolen from a collection decades ago, rumored to resurface occasionally in black market auctions. Real or fake, it always sells. Now the fringe detail. There's a lesser-known belief from that era, that wearing embroidered poetry could alter fate. Not literally, no one's casting spells, but emotionally. To wear someone's words was to absorb them. To carry their longing on your skin was to protect them from forgetting. A love stitch, in essence. Some lovers would embroider their poems into the inside of travel robes, believing that as long as the other wore it, the bond remained unbroken. Others stitched entire letters into linings, designed never to be read, just felt. Not all romances survive exile, but some outlast distance because they're written in motion, not ink. And this is where the scholars begin to quarrel. Was Zhu Lian sending a message to Shen Rui or to the people watching? Was it protest or mourning? Some argue she was trying to get him recalled. Others say she was just making sure no one forgot what they did to him. But one theory, darker and more poetic, suggests she knew he was dead. That the robe wasn't a message, it was a burial, a performance as eulogy, and that the dancer's second robe, with the hands never touching, was her way of saying goodbye, not to his body, to the possibility. You think of her, now not the dancer, not the poet, but Julian, in a quiet room, choosing thread the way some people choose their last words. One wrong color and the message is lost. One wrong stitch and everything's too loud. She gets it perfect. And when the robe is done, she doesn't cry, she doesn't sigh, she just folds it. Because some grief is sharper when you don't show it that. So what about you? If someone you loved disappeared, was taken, forgotten, exiled from your life without explanation, how would you answer? Not with a letter, not with a shout, maybe with silk, maybe with thread, a line stitched into a hem, a name hidden in the swirl of a wave, a memory sewn into the sleeve you wear most often, not to beg them back, just to say, you were here, and I still wear you. The first thing you notice is the red. Not bright red like lacquer or lipstick, but a deeper, darker red, the color of rusted iron or dried hibiscus tea. It's not dye, it's blood. Tiny flecks of it, embedded in the hem of a silk sleeve, dried into the edge of a pillowcase, blended into the thread of a war bride's wedding robe. You're in a storage room now, somewhere beneath a war-torn ancestral home in Sichuan. The air is thick with mildew and memory. And everything here, robes, handkerchiefs, undergarments, is stitched not just with silk, but with DNA. Welcome to the history no one talks about. How lovers, in times of war, wove blood and hair into embroidery as a final act of love, defiance, or, sometimes, madness. Because when everything else is taken from you, what's left but the body? And what's more intimate than stitching that body into fabric, so it might stay even when the person doesn't? There's a robe in front of you now. Pale peach silk, worn thin in places but still shimmering. At first glance, it's traditional, a phoenix spreading its wings, peonies in bloom, a cloud motif trailing across the shoulders. But then you see it, tucked beneath the phoenix's eye, a single strand of black hair, looped deliberately through the stitching. It's not loose, it's part of the design. And once you spot it, you start noticing them everywhere, hair stitched into vines, blood-tipped petals, knots tied with fingernail fragments. It sounds gruesome, but it isn't. It's heartbreakingly tender. These were keepsakes made during invasions, sieges, forced separations. Lovers and spouses embedding themselves literally into garments. If you couldn't stay, you could still be worn. If you couldn't survive, you could still be remembered. One story hits like a punch in the ribs. A soldier named Wei Liang, conscripted during the Taiping Rebellion, promised his bride he'd return. He didn't, but he sent her a sash. The design was classic waves, cranes, chrysanthemums. But woven into the inner lining was a small stitched bird, and its beak held a loop of something dark. Her hair, the same strand she had wrapped around his wrist the night before he left. He stitched it back into the sash with his own blood and a line of poetry that said, "The wind will not carry me far from you." She never wore the sash. She kept it sealed in a box. When she died decades later, the fabric was still damp from the rice wine she poured on it every New Year's Eve. Here's your sensual detail of the hour. From Sex with Kings, there's the scandalous case of a rebel general and his secret lover, a male court musician. Forbidden from being seen together in life, they embroidered their bond into matching silk tunics, each bearing half of a piana pattern, only complete when they stood side by side. The twist? They used each other's hair for the peony petals. The tunics were hidden during raids, smuggled through 3 provinces, and eventually reunited in a private shrine long after both men died in battle. When discovered, they were displayed for only one night before a magistrate deemed them inappropriate. They were quietly returned to the shrine and sealed in clay, but photos exist. Scholars have studied the threads. One calls them the most emotionally explicit textile in Chinese military history. Another simply called them undeniable. Fringe detail time. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, resistance fighters' families often embroidered talismans with locks of hair, or pricked blood signatures to send with them. Some included prayers, others stitched maps and code. But the most touching were soul pockets, small, hidden pouches in inner robes containing hair, blood, or teeth from loved ones. Not as witchcraft, as memory, as grief insurance. One fighter was found wearing 7. He called them his family of ghosts, always with him. That detail stayed with the nurse who treated him. She later stitched a single red thread into her white uniform every day she worked, in silent tribute. But was this common or fringe? Historians debate it. Some say blood thread embroidery was rare, romanticized later by poets and playwrights. Others argue it was simply underreported, too private to catalog. After all, no woman wanted to explain why her hemline bled slightly when touched. No man wanted to admit his sash was laced with his wife's braid. But artifacts don't lie. X-rays, fiber testing, and ultraviolet analysis of several 19th century garments have confirmed human DNA in the embroidery thread. Not everywhere, but enough. Enough to know this was real. Enough to realize that some people wore their lovers literally to the end. You think of it now, threading someone's hair through a needle, not as craft, but as communion. Not as decor, but as refusal to let them be erased. Not, I miss you, but I will carry you. Would you do it? Could you? Maybe not now. Maybe not ever. But imagine being told your love was impossible, your body disposable, your memory forgettable, and still deciding, with steady hands and breath held tight, to stitch a part of yourself into something soft. Something that would be touched, folded, remembered, not buried, not burned. So what would you choose? If you had to give someone one piece of yourself, woven into fabric, what would it be? A strand of hair? A drop of blood? A fingerprint in the thread? You don't need to decide now. But silk remembers. And some stitches never unravel. The ban came quietly like all good scandals do. No drums, no edicts screamed in the town square. Just a short line in a government circular, effective immediately. Embroidery of suggestive or lewd nature is prohibited in all garments of public display. That was it, one sentence. But it shook the silk markets from Nanjing to Guangzhou. You were allowed dragons. You were allowed cranes. You could have peonies, lotuses, waves, stars. But anything that hinted too boldly, too creatively at bodies, in motion, at longing wrapped in petals, at erotic symbolism spun into daily wear, forbidden, outlawed, confiscated if found. And that's when things got interesting. Because whenever art gets banned, it gets better. Welcome to the rise of the underground, the black market in naughty needlework, where forbidden's desires were. Stitched into silk with defiance, daring, and just enough deniability to keep you one step ahead of the censors. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1800s. The Qing court is growing nervous. Morality crackdowns are trending. Whispered rumors of overly affectionate wives, rebellious concubines, and embroidery circles gone rogue reach the ears of brittle old men in power. So they decide to draw a line. They tell seamstresses and garment makers that certain motifs overlapping, peaches, intertwined fish with expressive tails, butterflies fluttering too close to the lotus, are no longer appropriate. One official even publishes a pamphlet warning that clothing should uplift the soul, not provoke it. He's later found wearing embroidered socks with grapes that look suspiciously like something else. But we digress. The point is, a lot of people took that ban seriously. But others? They got creative. Seamstresses began hiding symbols beneath collars, inside hems, on inner layers meant only for private viewing. An innocent robe on the outside might contain a whole romance on the inside. vines creeping toward a kiss, two birds locked in midair, waves crashing in synchronized spirals. Some even developed a code using combinations of thread counts, colors, and stitch angles to imply entire stories. A pink thread at 60 degrees curving left. Yearning. A silver double knot surrounded by plum blossom petals. Physical satisfaction. Imagine wearing that under your wedding robe, smiling sweetly while the ants fussed over your hairstyle, unaware you were wrapped in low-key erotica from neck to toe. Now for the juiciest thread of all. From Sex with Kings, we get the tale of a courtesan named Yin Ro, who, when threatened with arrest for morally disruptive embroidery, went underground literally. She opened a tea house with a secret embroidery studio below the floorboards. Clients came not just for tea, but for custom commissions. Robes, fans, gloves, even intimate items like sleep masks and undergarments, all stitched with symbolic, suggestive, sometimes outrageously specific designs. One customer reportedly requested a sleeve that captured the rhythm of a dream I had 3 years ago. She delivered. The studio was dubbed the Blush Cellar, and though it lasted less than a decade before being shut down in a sweep, its influence lingered. Survivors of the raid claimed that Yin Ro kept a master catalog of her designs hidden inside a hollowed-out jade pillow. That pillow, if it still exists, has never been found. And here's a fringe twist that would make a censor choke on his chrysanthemum. Some officials' own wives began commissioning band motifs privately, of course using pseudonyms. One woman, married to a notoriously uptight magistrate, requested a nightgown embroidered with a peach orchard that never stops blooming. When questioned, she claimed it was a metaphor for spring. Scholars still debate whether she was trolling her husband or just needed better dreams. The underground spread fast. In back alleys and discreet courtyards, seamstresses formed informal guilds to protect their clients and share techniques. One group developed a way to blend thread colors so subtly that erotic patterns only revealed themselves in moonlight. Another used mirrored stitching that appeared innocent until viewed from an angle. Suddenly, lovers were giving each other robes that winked when turned. Fans fluttered open to show innocent clouds, then closed again with lovers' silhouettes pressed into the edges. Even accessories got the treatment. Silk purses that opened to reveal secret garden scenes, slippers that left suggestive imprints in fine dust, handkerchiefs that, when folded properly, formed erotic rebuses. And yes, of course, the censors knew. But they couldn't stop it. For every robe confiscated, 2 more appeared. For every tailor arrested, 3 took her place. And because everything was symbolic, nothing was technically illegal. One inspector famously gave up after spending 3 hours trying to prove that a particular embroidery was pornographic. The design? 2 squirrels sharing a peach. He couldn't make the case, but everyone knew. Academics are still sorting it all out. Was this truly resistance? Or just a clever way for women to claim private power in a world that policed their bodies? And silence? Did the underground embroidery movement create space for agency, or just another layer of secrecy in a life already hidden? Some scholars argue it was feminist art in disguise. Others claim it was escapism, not activism. But here's what no one denies. The stitches were real. The emotions were real. And for many, the embroidery was the only safe place left to express longing, desire, humor, even rage. You picture one robe in particular described in a contraband catalog, passed from collector to collector, printed on rice paper so thin it dissolves in rain. The robe is plain on the outside, white and blue, with bamboo and clouds. But inside, a storm, red cranes in midair, blossoms curling inward, a garden wall breaking. It was titled Whisper Before Thunder. The seamstress who made it was never named, but the robe, it still appears in stories. A myth stitched into fabric. A secret that wears itself. So what would your forbidden embroidery be? Not loud, Not obvious, just a whisper in silk. A petal folded the wrong way. A wave curling with just a little too much heat. What desire would you hide in thread, where only one pair of hands might ever find it? You don't have to say. Just imagine it. Let the design unfold quietly, secretly, until even your own skin starts to blush. The sound you hear first is the scratch of a needle against silence. No music, no clink of wine cups. Just thread whispering through fabric in a barracks lit by a single oil lamp. You're not in a palace anymore. You're in a military outpost deep in the mountains of western China, and the man stitching isn't a court eunuch or a tailor's apprentice. He's a soldier skin like sun-bleached parchment, hands calloused from sword grips, not silk. But tonight, he's holding a needle. And what he's stitching? A pair of koi fish swimming and opposing. Spirals. The thread trembles just slightly in his hands. Because for him, this isn't art. It's survival. This is the story you haven't heard, when men learned to stitch not as craft, but as code, as memory, as the last thread between what was taken from them and what they still hope to keep. War has a way of rewiring necessity during certain conscription waves, particularly in the late Qing period. Young men were torn from home so fast they couldn't even pack. Many had mothers or sisters who, in their panic, stitched talismans, tokens of protection, into their sons' undershirts or collars. It became customary, expected. But then came the twist. The men began stitching back. Not for beauty, not even always legibly, but as a way to write what they couldn't say, to anchor what they feared they'd forget. Some sewed names into the linings of their boots. Others stitched images, a plum blossom, a roof tile, a lover's silhouette into scarf hems and wrist cuffs. Needle and thread, usually reserved for the feminine world, became the only tool left when words wouldn't reach past distance or death. One account, pulled from a soldier's diary preserved in a remote temple archive, tells of a boy named June. He was 17, conscripted within hours of his older brother's funeral. In his first week on the road, he used a broken fishing hook and horsehair to stitch a single eye onto his undershirt. His mother's eye, he said, so she could keep watching. When that shirt wore through, he cut the eye out and sewed it into the lining of his uniform. He fought for 6 years, never lost the eye. When he returned home half a man, trembling, he burned the shirt and stitched the same eye onto his daughter's christening blanket. So she'll always be seen, he wrote. Let's not forget the sensual stories, because yes, even here, even under the weight of armor and ash, desire didn't die. In the erotic spirit through history, one of the most haunting entries involves 2 male soldiers who shared a tent during a brutal winter siege. One embroidered the initials of the other onto the inside of his collar, not as decoration, but so he could feel the thread against his skin whenever he moved. When the collar was eventually destroyed in battle, he carried the torn scrap under his chest plate. When asked why, he simply said, "I need something warm." The other soldier never returned from patrol. The one who lived stitched the same initials in smaller and smaller loops onto every cuff, sleeve, and glove he owned for the rest of his life. His final tunic, found posthumously, bore the letters 108 times, tiny, precise, like a rosary in thread. And here's your fringe. During major battles, certain field medics were trained to identify hidden embroidery in uniforms, not for medical reasons, but because commanders knew that some of these stitched pieces were coded. Thread color could indicate unit origin, loyalty, or even battlefield confessions. One commander allegedly sentenced a young conscript to lashes after finding a vine motif stitched into his inner hem. Why? Because the vine looped counterclockwise. In certain underground circles, that signaled regret. And regret was close to desertion. The boy didn't speak. He just bled into the same silk he'd stitched. Scholars still debate if the code was real or imagined. But the stitch was unmistakable, which leads us to the big question. Was this embroidery an act of resistance or just ritual? Some researchers argue that these men weren't reclaiming femininity. They were surviving with whatever tools were left. Others insist it was deeper, that stitching became a quiet rebellion against the violence imposed on their bodies and the silence expected of their emotions. Either way, what can't be denied is the tenderness. Rough hands threading soft. Symbols into cloth that would never be seen, never praised, never even spoken of. Just worn, just felt. There's a robe in a museum in Tianjin that stopped a textile historian in her tracks. It's plain, mud-dyed. The embroidery is only visible under UV light. But once illuminated, you see it, the outline of a face. Eyes closed, mouth half open, stitched directly over the heart. The robe belonged to a soldier who never married. When asked, he said he had no one. The embroidery says otherwise. So now you're here, in this makeshift barracks with a man who should be sleeping or sharpening his blade, but instead, he's sewing, slowly, carefully. You watch him finish the final stitch, a flower maybe, or a memory. He doesn't name it. He doesn't need to. He just presses his thumb over the thread, holds it there for a second, then folds the cloth over and tucks it away like a secret. And maybe that's the truth. That sometimes stitching isn't about beauty or rebellion or even love. Sometimes it's just the last thing standing between forgetting and being forgotten. So what would you stitch if you had nothing left but thread and time? Not for anyone to see, just for yourself. Just so you wouldn't vanish entirely. Close your eyes. Let your fingers remember. You're in a room that doesn't exist anymore. Not officially. The walls have been torn down, the garden paved over, the archive burned in a suspicious fire. But if you sit quietly, if you listen hard enough between breaths, you'll feel the echo of thread moving through silk, slow and deliberate. You're in a ghost house now, walking through the remnants of a love story never meant to be remembered. Stitched into garments never meant to survive, but they did. Because silk doesn't forget. Tonight, we step into the final chapter. The legend of the ghost threads embroidery said to bind lovers beyond death. Garments that carry unfinished emotions and the belief, still whispered in rural towns, that if two people stitch their truth into the same fabric, they'll find each other again in the afterlife. It begins with a wedding robe, of course it does. But this one was never worn. The bride, Mei Yan, died the day before the ceremony. A fever that came on fast and took her faster. Her mother, grief-shattered, kept the robe sealed in a wooden box, untouched for decades, until the day it began to hum, not with sound, with heat, with something that made the local priest mutter prayers under his breath and suggest it be burned. But Mei Yan's younger sister, stubborn and half in love with ghosts, opened the box instead. What she found wasn't just a robe. It was alive, with thread that shimmered differently under moonlight, petals that curled and unfurled, birds that always seemed to look back at you, no matter where you stood. And hidden in the sleeve lining, a name not her betrothed's, but that of Mei, Yan's childhood friend, a girl she shared everything with. Except permission. It wasn't a wedding robe. It was a burial of confession. A truth stitched into silk when speech was too dangerous. And now, the robe pulsed with it. Tales of garments like these exist all over China's textile folklore. They're called Hanziu, soul thread embroidery. Some were made before death, some after. All were believed to carry emotional residue. Not just memory, but presence. One tale from Anhui tells of a man who married 3 times, but each bride wore the same cursed veil embroidered by his first love, who had drowned. Each wife reported dreams of water, of cold fingers brushing their necks, of a voice whispering, "You don't belong in this fabric." After the 3rd wife fled, the man burned the veil, or claimed to. A century later, a piece of it was found sewn into a temple banner, the thread still damp to the touch. From the erotic spirit through history comes a record of a nobleman who kept a chamber filled with robes never worn, each made for a different lover who died before consummation. He believed wearing the robes during sleep would summon them. He was mocked, of course, until guests began reporting chills, flickering lights, and embroidered animals that moved between visits. One robe, stitched with 2 phoenixes flying toward the sun, was found repositioned with 1 phoenix turned away. The nobleman was found the next morning with thread wrapped around his fingers. The room was sealed. The story, however, slipped out like smoke. Now your final sex story, strange and lovely. In the Ming Dynasty, a courtesan known only as Spring, after snow, was buried with her favorite robe embroidered by her and her lover with intertwining vines, a single rose, and 2 names stitched upside down beneath the collar. The legend goes, if 2 souls stitch their names into the same piece of fabric in mirrored placement, their spirits will find each other no matter where death scatters them. A belief? Maybe, but 20 years later, her lover's grave was dug up during a flood and wrapped inside his robes, a strip of her sleeve, torn before burial, still intact, still bearing her name, faint but legible. Let's not forget the fringe belief still lingering in parts of southern China, that garments can carry emotional residue strong enough to haunt, not ghosts in the horror movie sense, but feelings, longing, regret, hope so concentrated it doesn't dissolve even after the body is gone. Some families burn clothing, not just to send it with the dead, but to protect the living from the weight of love left unfinished. Others pass down certain items, never wearing them, only keeping them near. One widow said of her late wife's robe, "It still breathes." When asked to explain, she only shrugged. You'll understand when you touch it. And that's what the scholars still argue over. Is this just superstition? A way for grief to feel tangible? Or is there something to it, some frequency embedded in the rhythm of stitching, the tension of thread, the imprint of skin against silk that holds on tighter than logic allows? Embroidery has always been about speaking without saying. So maybe the soul just lingers where the message was clearest. Maybe love, once threaded, doesn't vanish. It frays, it softens, but it doesn't disappear. You're holding a robe now. You didn't mean to. You just found it, folded neatly, tucked into a drawer you weren't supposed to open. The silk is soft. Too soft. The thread glints silver and red. And there inside the hem is a name you recognize, not yours, but someone's you wish you could have said more to. Someone who slipped away while you were still rehearsing your goodbye. You run your thumb along the edge. You don't cry. Not quite. But something in you shifts dots, so maybe this is the truth. That embroidery doesn't just record beauty, or rebellion, or lust. It records presence, emotion, memory woven so tightly into cloth that it refuses to let go, that it waits, that it whispers, that it reaches for us long after the needle has stopped moving. Now that the thread has reached its final knot, let yourself breathe a little slower. You've traveled through centuries of whispers, secrets, laughter behind sleeves, tears stitched into linings, desire blooming beneath peonies, love twisted into the very silk that once wrapped around skin and spirit alike. You've seen how women, sometimes men, sometimes both used thread not to decorate, but to speak, to resist, to remember. The quiet art of embroidery became something louder than any shout. It was memory in motion, a diary disguised in satin, a rebellion hidden in beauty. So now, as the lanterns dim and the night grows softer, let the final images fade gently into your thoughts. A sleeve brushed with someone's breath, a sash woven with longing, a pillow carrying the echo of laughter that no longer fills the room. Not everything stitched was meant to be seen, but now you've seen it. And maybe, just maybe, you felt a thread or two stir in your own memory. A person, a name, a goodbye you still carry. Let them rest now, folded neatly beside you. Let the silk settle, the threads sleep, and if you dream tonight of gardens of cranes, of petals curling softly in moonlight, don't be alarmed. You're just remembering what someone once embroidered for you, long before you knew how to look. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.